Before Christopher Columbus ever dreamed of sailing west, before Spanish conquistadors ever whispered the word gold in their sleep, there was already thunder in the mountains of what we now call the American Southwest. But this wasn't the thunder of storms rolling across empty peaks. This was the thunder of horses' hooves, of warriors moving like shadows through stone canyons, of a people so perfectly adapted to their land that they seemed less like human beings and more like forces of nature themselves, the Apache. Now here's the thing that gets me about how we usually tell this story. We start with the Spanish arriving, as if history began the moment Europeans showed up with their metal armor and their diseases and their absolute certainty that they were the protagonists of world history. But the Apache had already been writing their own history in these mountains for centuries, before any European ever laid eyes on the New World. And what a history it was. Picture this landscape for a moment. 4 sacred peaks rising like ancient sentinels from a high desert that stretches beyond the horizon. In the east, White Mountain, where Apache origin stories tell us white-painted woman gave birth to Child of Water, the twin heroes who would teach the people how to survive in a world full of monsters. The San Francisco peaks standing guard in the west, Blue Mountain watching from the south, and in the north, another sacred peak overseeing it all like some vast stone grandfather keeping watch over his descendants. This wasn't empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. This was home. A home so thoroughly understood by its inhabitants that they could read the landscape like you or I might read a book. They knew which canyon would have water in August, which ridge would shelter them from winter storms, where the mescal plants would be ready for harvest when the days grew long in spring. The Apache moved through this country following rhythms older than any European calendar. Spring meant mescal harvesting, backbreaking work digging the massive hearts of agave plants from rocky soil, then roasting them in earth ovens that took days to complete properly. Summer brought hunting parties ranging across hundreds of miles, tracking deer and elk through mountain forests that seemed to go on forever. When autumn painted the aspen groves gold and silver, entire bands would converge on the pinon pine forests, gathering nuts that would sustain them through the long winter months. But don't picture some peaceful pastoral existence here. This was hard country that demanded hard people. The Apache didn't just live in this landscape. They had been forged by it, generation after generation, until they became something unique in human history. Warriors? Yes, but calling them warriors misses the larger point. They were survivalists on a level that would make modern special forces operators look like weekend campers. Take Lozan, for instance. Born sometime in the 1830s, this young Apache woman could outride and outshoot her brothers. And that's saying something, because Apache men were considered the finest light cavalry in the world. But Lozan was different. She possessed what her people called the power, a spiritual gift that allowed her to sense the presence of enemies. During raids, she would stand with her arms outstretched, palms facing out, turning slowly in a circle until her hands grew warm. That warmth would tell her the direction and distance of approaching soldiers. Think about that for a moment. In a world without radios, without surveillance satellites, without any of the technology we take for granted, this woman could function as a human early warning system, and she wasn't unique. Apache society produced people like this regularly, individuals so perfectly adapted to their environment that they seemed to possess supernatural abilities. Men who could track a single horse across solid rock, women who could identify a person by their footprints from days before, children who learned to move through thick brush without making a sound before they could properly walk. This was the world the Spanish stumbled into in the 1500s, and they had absolutely no idea what they were dealing with. The conquistadors came north from Mexico, following rumors, always following rumors. Cities of gold, streets paved with silver, mountains where you could pick up precious stones like fallen fruit. They brought their horses and their steel weapons and their absolute confidence in European superiority, and they marched into the Apache homelands expecting to find, well, what they'd found everywhere else. Indigenous peoples who would be overawed by European technology, intimidated by horses, quick to submit to Spanish authority. Instead, they found something that shouldn't have been possible. They found an enemy that adapted faster than they could react. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Apache didn't just resist Spanish colonization, they transformed it. Within a single generation, these master warriors had figured out everything there was to know about horses. Not just how to ride them, though they became the finest horsemen on the continent. They learned how to breed them, how to train them for warfare, how to use them to completely revolutionize their way of life. And then they began to raid. Now, when we use the word raid in modern English, we might think of quick military strikes or maybe police raids on criminal hideouts. But Apache raiding was something entirely different. It was an art form, a science, and a way of life all rolled into one. These weren't desperate attacks by starving people. These were precisely planned operations carried out by small groups of warriors who could cover hundreds of miles in a matter of days, strike their targets with devastating effectiveness, and then vanish back into their mountain strongholds like smoke dissolving in morning air. The Spanish settlements in Sonora and Chihuahua became the Apache hunting grounds. A typical raid might involve 8 to 12 warriors covering 300 miles in 4 days, hitting a ranch or small town, capturing horses and cattle, and disappearing before Spanish soldiers could even be alerted to the attack. The Spanish would send pursuit columns, 50, 100, sometimes 200 heavily armed men, and they would find nothing. Tracks that led to rocky ground and then seemed to simply vanish. Waterholes where the raiders had stopped to rest, but no indication of which direction they'd gone from there. The Apache had figured out something that would take European military theorists centuries to understand. In the right terrain, a small force with superior mobility and local knowledge could make life miserable for a much larger occupying army. They were practicing asymmetric warfare 300 years before anyone had invented the term. But this wasn't just about military tactics. The arrival of Spanish settlements and the beginning of Apache raiding created something unprecedented in human history, a hybrid economy that bridged two completely different worlds. Apache bands would raid Spanish settlements for manufactured goods, metal tools, cloth, weapons, livestock. But they would also trade with those same settlements during periods of temporary peace. A band might raid a ranch in Sonora one month, then show up at the same ranch 3 months later, wanting to trade deer hides for corn and tobacco. The Spanish colonial administrators went crazy trying to figure out how to deal with this. How do you negotiate with people who might trade with you on Tuesday and raid your supply column on Thursday? How do you maintain control over territory when the actual inhabitants of that territory can appear and disappear at will? They couldn't, that's the simple answer. For 300 years, 3 centuries, the most powerful empire on Earth could not establish effective control over Apache territory. Oh, they built presidios, military fortresses, and they garrisoned them with soldiers. They sent expedition after expedition into the mountains. They offered bounties for Apache scalps and negotiated treaty after treaty that fell apart within months. But the Apache remained free, remained dangerous, and remained absolutely in control of their homeland. Think about this from the Apache perspective. These strange pale men had appeared from nowhere, claiming to own land that had belonged to Apache families for countless generations. They brought new animals, horses, cattle, pigs, and new diseases that killed Apache children. They built their settlements in places where Apache people had gathered food and held ceremonies for hundreds of years. And then they acted surprised when the Apache treated them as invaders. But the Apache didn't just resist, they adapted. They incorporated horses into their culture so completely that within 2 generations, Europeans were writing reports that described them as if they'd been born in the saddle. They learned to use European weapons and tools while maintaining their traditional skills. They developed new tactics that combined ancient Apache knowledge of the terrain with the mobility that horses provided. Most importantly, they remained Apache. They didn't abandon their languages, their ceremonies, their complex kinship systems, or their spiritual relationship with the land. They simply found ways to preserve all of that while dealing with the new reality of Spanish colonization, and they were phenomenally good at it. By the late 1700s, Spanish colonial records show that Apache raids were reaching as far south as Mexico City itself. Small groups of Apache warriors would slip through hundreds of miles of supposedly controlled territory, strike targets that should have been completely safe, and then melt back into the northern mountains like ghosts. The economic damage was staggering. Entire regions of northern Mexico were effectively depopulated as Spanish. Settlers fled south to escape the constant threat of Apache attack. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. The Apache weren't united under a single leader or following a coordinated military strategy. There was no Apache nation in the European sense, no central government issuing orders to warrior bands spread across thousands of square miles of territory. Instead, there were dozens of independent groups, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Western Apache, Jicarilla, each following their own leaders, making their own decisions about when to raid and when to make peace. And yet somehow, without modern communications or centralized command, they managed to keep the Spanish Empire off balance for 3 centuries. That's not just military skill. That's something approaching genius-level strategic thinking spread across an entire culture. The Spanish tried everything. They tried military campaigns led by their most experienced officers. They tried negotiated settlements, offering the Apache everything from annual tribute payments to guaranteed hunting rights. They tried playing different Apache groups against each other. They even tried relocating peaceful Apache bands to special reservations near Spanish settlements, hoping to create a buffer between hostile Apache and Spanish colonists. Nothing worked for very long. The fundamental problem was that the Spanish were trying to impose European concepts, territorial sovereignty, centralized authority, written treaties, on a people whose entire worldview was based on different principles. The Apache understood the land in terms of family relationships and spiritual connections that went back generations. They understood authority in terms of personal respect and demonstrated competence, not inherited titles or bureaucratic appointments. They understood agreements in terms of mutual benefit and changing circumstances, not written documents signed in distant capitals. And they understood freedom in a way that Europeans had almost forgotten. Not freedom as a political concept or a legal status, but freedom as a way of being in the world. The freedom to follow the seasons and the game and the availability of food plants. The freedom to make decisions as a family or a band without reference to distant authorities. The freedom to defend your homeland against invaders without asking permission from anyone. This is what the Spanish were really up against. Not just military resistance, but a completely different way of understanding what it meant to be human in the world. And for 300 years, that way of understanding proved stronger than all the technology and military organization that European civilization could bring to bear against it. But change was coming. By the early 1800s, Spanish colonial authority was weakening throughout the Americas. Independence movements were gaining strength in Mexico and South America. The Apache homelands, caught between a declining Spanish Empire and an expanding United States, were about to become the scene of conflicts that would make the Spanish colonial period look like a minor disagreement between neighbors. The thunder in the mountains was about to get a lot louder. The year 1821 changed everything, though it would take years for the Apache to understand just how much. Mexican independence from Spain wasn't supposed to matter to people living in mountain strongholds hundreds of miles from Mexico City. But new governments need to prove themselves, and nothing proves governmental authority quite like solving problems the previous regime couldn't handle. The Apache, who had kept Spanish colonizers off balance for 3 centuries, suddenly found themselves facing a Mexican republic with something to prove, and Mexico's solution was as simple as it was horrifying. 100 pesos for every Apache scalp. Think about that number for a moment. 100 pesos in 1825 could buy you a decent horse, 6 months of supplies, or a small piece of land. The Mexican government was essentially offering a year's wages for proof that you'd killed an Apache. Any Apache, man, woman, or child, the bounty made no distinction. This wasn't warfare anymore. This was genocide with a price list. But here's the thing about the Apache: they didn't break under pressure. They adapted. And when they adapted to Mexican policies, they became something the world had never seen before. A loose confederation of independent bands operating like a perfectly coordinated military machine. Standing at the center of this transformation was a man whose physical presence alone commanded respect. Mangas Coloradas, red sleeves, stood 6 feet 4 inches tall in his moccasins, a giant by the standards of his time. But his real power wasn't physical. It was political. This man understood something that most Apache leaders hadn't grasped yet. Survival in this new world would require unity on a scale the Apache had never achieved. Mangas Coloradas began weaving together the scattered Apache bands through the oldest diplomatic tool known to humanity: marriage. His daughters married into the Chiricahua, the Mimbres, the Bedonkohe. His sons took wives from distant bands. Most importantly, he gave his daughter to a rising war leader named Cochise, creating an alliance that would reshape the entire Southwest. But let's be clear about what Apache society was becoming during this period. The traditional economy, hunting, gathering, seasonal migrations, was evolving into something far more complex. Apache bands were developing what modern economists might recognize as a sophisticated mixed economy. They still followed the old seasonal patterns, still gathered mezcal and piñon nuts and hunted deer in the high country. But they'd also integrated Mexican settlements into their economic system like a river flowing around stones. Raids provided manufactured goods, metal tools that held an edge better than stone, cloth that lasted longer than hide, firearms that extended hunting range. But the Apache weren't just taking these things randomly. They were targeting specific items they needed, leaving behind things that had no value in their economy. Spanish records from this period describe Apache raiders who would break into a warehouse, take all the knives and metal arrowheads, and leave behind silver coins and religious artifacts without touching them. And then there were the slaves. This is one of those historical realities that makes modern people uncomfortable. But we can't understand Apache society during this period without acknowledging it. Mexican settlements weren't just sources of manufactured goods, they were sources of labor. Apache raids regularly captured Mexican civilians who were then incorporated into Apache society as workers. These weren't slaves in the European sense, chattel property to be bought and sold. They were more like indentured servants who worked Apache fields, tended Apache horses, and often eventually married into Apache families. The Mexican response to this evolving Apache economy was to escalate the violence. If bounties on scalps weren't working, maybe bounties on live captives would. If military expeditions weren't effective, maybe civilian militias would be. If small rewards weren't motivating enough scalp hunters, maybe larger rewards would. This escalation reached its peak on a hot day in April 1837. When a white American trader named James Johnson invited Mangas Coloradas and his people to a feast near the Santa Rita copper mines. Johnson had been trading with the Apache for months, building trust, establishing relationships. He'd been invited to Apache camps, had shared meals with Apache families, had been treated with the hospitality that Apache culture demanded for guests. And on this April day, he invited Mangas Coloradas and about 100 of his people to share a meal in return. The Apache came as they always did. Men, women, children, entire families gathering for what should have been a celebration of friendship between peoples. They brought their best food, their finest clothes. Children played while adults talked and laughed. It was exactly the kind of peaceful gathering that both sides desperately needed. And then Johnson gave a signal. and a hidden cannon loaded with scrap metal fired directly into the crowd of Apache families. 20 people died instantly. Women holding babies, children who'd been playing a moment before, warriors who'd trusted in the ancient laws of hospitality. The survivors scattered in panic, while Johnson's men finished off the wounded with rifles and knives. But Mangus Coloradus survived. And in that moment, as he looked at the bodies of his people scattered around a feast they'd been invited to share, something fundamental changed in Apache-white relations. This wasn't just another raid or another battle. This was betrayal of the most basic human customs, a violation of laws so ancient and universal that they transcended cultural differences. The war that followed would last for 50 years and cost thousands of lives on both sides. But it began in that moment when Mangus Coloradus realized that there were some white men who couldn't be trusted with the most basic obligations of civilization. Among the Apache who witnessed Johnson's massacre was a young warrior named Goyakla. He was in his 20s, already known as a skilled fighter and hunter, but not yet the legendary figure he would become. Like many Apache men, he supplemented his family's income by trading with Mexican settlements, traveling to towns like Llanos to exchange Apache goods for Mexican-manufactured items. In the spring of 1851, Goyakla was returning from one such trading expedition when he found his camp destroyed. Mexican soldiers had attacked while the men were away, following a strategy that was becoming depressingly common: hit Apache families when the warriors were absent. Kill or capture everyone who couldn't fight back. Then retreat before the men returned. His mother was dead. His wife was dead. His 3 young children were dead. The young man who returned to that burned camp was not the same person who had left it days before. Goyakla, which meant one who yawns, died in that moment along with his family. The man who emerged from that tragedy would be known by a different name, one that would make enemies tremble from Arizona to Mexico City: Geronimo. But individual tragedies, no matter how profound, were about to be overshadowed by changes that would reshape the entire continent. In February 1848, Mexican and American diplomats signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the Mexican-American War. With a few pen strokes on paper in a room thousands of miles away, the Apache homelands suddenly belonged to the United States of America. Not a single Apache leader had been consulted. Not one Apache signature appeared on the treaty. The Apache weren't even mentioned in the document that transferred their territory from Mexican to American control. As far as the treaty was concerned, the land was empty, waiting for American settlers to fill it with farms and towns and all the blessings of American civilization. The Apache had a different perspective on this development. They'd been fighting Mexicans for 27 years. They'd developed tactics, strategies, and weapons specifically designed to counter Mexican military advantages. They understood Mexican weaknesses and had learned to exploit Mexican political divisions. Now they were told they had new enemies. Americans were moving west in unprecedented numbers, drawn by California gold and Oregon farmland, and the simple promise of free land for anyone willing to take it. These Americans brought different weapons, different tactics, different ideas about how to deal with the Indian problem. But here's what the Americans didn't understand as they began moving into Apache territory. They weren't facing the same Apache who had fought the Spanish 3 centuries earlier. They were facing a people who had spent 300 years perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare. The Apache of 1848 had weapons that combined the best of traditional and European technology. They had horses bred and trained for warfare. They had intelligence networks that stretched across thousands of square miles. Most importantly, they had leaders like Mangus Coloradus and Cochise, who understood how to coordinate independent bands into a fighting force that could challenge conventional armies. The Americans were about to discover that conquering Apache territory on paper was very different from controlling it in reality. The mountains that had swallowed Spanish expeditions and Mexican armies were still there, still offering refuge to people who knew every canyon and waterhole and hidden trail, and those people were no longer content to simply raid and retreat. 3 centuries of conflict had taught them that survival required more than just successful raids. It required sending a message that would make potential enemies think twice before entering Apache territory. The thunder in the mountains wasn't just getting louder. It was about to become a storm that would reshape the American West. The stagecoaches started rolling through Apache Pass in 1858, and for a brief moment, it looked like maybe, just maybe, peace was possible. Cochise controlled the pass. Anyone who wanted to move freight or passengers between Tucson and the Rio Grande had to go through his territory. And Cochise had made a decision that surprised everyone. He was going to try cooperation instead of war. The Butterfield Overland Mail Company needed wood for their way station at Apache Pass, and Cochise supplied it. His warriors provided security for the coaches in exchange for regular payments of food and supplies. For nearly 3 years, this arrangement worked. Stagecoaches rolled through the heart of Chiricahua territory unmolested, while Apache families received steady supplies of corn, tobacco, and manufactured goods without the risks that came with raiding. It was a perfect example of what could happen when both sides approached each other with something resembling good faith. The Americans got safe passage through dangerous territory. The Apache got access to trade goods without having to fight for them. Everybody won. And then Lieutenant George Bascom arrived. Now here's what you need to understand about Bascom. He was young, maybe 25 years old, fresh out of West Point, full of military regulations and absolutely certain that he understood how to deal with Indians. He'd probably never seen an Apache warrior up close, had certainly never tried to negotiate with Apache leaders, but he had his orders and his training and his complete confidence in American military superiority. In January 1861, a 12-year-old boy named Felix Ward was kidnapped from a ranch southeast of Apache Pass. The ranch owner was convinced that Apache raiders had taken the boy, and he demanded that the army do something about it. So Lieutenant Bascom was sent to Apache Pass with orders to recover the child and arrest the Apache responsible for taking him. The problem was that Cochise hadn't taken the boy. The raid had been carried out by a completely different Apache band from more than 100 miles away. But Bascom didn't know that, and apparently didn't much care. As far as he was concerned, all Apache were responsible for anything any Apache did anywhere. On February 4th, Bascom invited Cochise to a parley under a flag of truce. Cochise came as Apache custom demanded, bringing along his brother, his 2 nephews, and his young son. They sat down in Bascom's tent to discuss the missing boy, and Cochise explained that he didn't have the child and didn't know who did, but that he would try to find out. And then Bascom made the decision that would transform the American Southwest into a battlefield. For the next 10 years, he told Cochise that he and his family would be held as hostages until the missing boy was returned. Think about this for a moment. Cochise had come voluntarily to a peace meeting under a flag of truce, following diplomatic protocols that both cultures recognized. He'd brought his family members as a gesture of good faith. And now this young lieutenant was telling him that he was a prisoner. Cochise's response was immediate and decisive. He pulled out a knife, slashed through the tent wall, and escaped in a matter of seconds. But his brother and nephews couldn't follow. Bascom's soldiers held them at gunpoint while their leader disappeared into the rocks outside the camp. What followed was a desperate attempt at negotiation. Cochise captured several Americans, including some stage station employees, hoping to trade them for his relatives. Bascom refused, demanding the return of Felix Ward, who Cochise didn't have and couldn't produce. For 6 days, the 2 sides tried to find some way out of the trap they'd created, and then Bascom decided to end the standoff by hanging Cochise's brother and 2 nephews, the Apache leader who had spent 3 years trying to make peace with the Americans watched. His family members die because a young officer couldn't distinguish between justice and revenge. In that moment, Cochise became something he'd never wanted to be, an implacable enemy of the United States. The boy, incidentally, was eventually found alive and well, living with the Apache band that had actually taken him. He'd been adopted into the family and was being raised as an Apache child. His Apache name was Mickey Free, and he would later serve as a scout for the U.S. Army against his adopted people. But that discovery came too late to matter. The damage was done. The Apache leader, who had demonstrated that peaceful coexistence was possible, had been betrayed during a truce negotiation. 3 innocent men were dead, and Cochise had learned a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. American promises meant nothing when American pride was at stake. The war that followed made everything that came before look like a minor disagreement. Cochise and Mangas Coloradas began coordinating their operations on a scale that neither Mexican nor American forces had ever faced. They weren't just raiding anymore. They were conducting military campaigns designed to drive every non-Apache out of their territory. Stage stations were attacked and burned. Wagon trains were ambushed. Isolated ranches were abandoned as word spread that Cochise was no longer interested in taking prisoners. The Butterfield Overland Mail Company suspended service through Apache. Travel between Tucson and the Rio Grande became so dangerous that freight companies demanded military escorts for every shipment. And then the American Civil War began, and suddenly the federal government had more pressing concerns than Apache raids in remote territories. Regular army units were pulled east to fight Confederates. Volunteer militia units were left to defend settlements that stretched across thousands of square miles of desert and mountain country. For Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, this was an opportunity they couldn't ignore. With American military strength at its lowest point in decades, they could finally drive the invaders out of Apache territory permanently. What followed was 18 months of warfare that brought the American frontier to the edge of complete collapse. But then General James Carleton arrived from California with a column of volunteers, and the nature of the conflict changed completely. Carleton was not a typical Indian fighting general. He wasn't interested in negotiated settlements or reservations, or any of the half measures that previous commanders had tried. His orders to his subordinates were simple and direct. All Apache men are to be killed wherever found. Women and children may be taken as prisoners. This wasn't warfare anymore. This was extermination. Carleton understood something that previous American commanders had missed. You couldn't defeat the Apache by chasing them through the mountains, but you could starve them by destroying their food supplies. He sent Kit Carson and other experienced scouts to systematically burn Apache food caches, destroy their hidden gardens, and make it impossible for Apache families to survive in their traditional homeland. The Apache found themselves facing a kind of warfare they'd never encountered before. Previous enemies had tried to defeat Apache warriors in battle. Carleton was trying to kill Apache children by starvation. In July 1862, Cochise and Mangas Coloradas made their stand at Apache Pass. They had chosen the ground carefully, a narrow canyon where superior numbers wouldn't help the Americans, where Apache warriors could fire down on any force trying to pass through. They had never lost a battle in this terrain, but Carleton's troops brought something the Apache had never faced. Howitzers. The first explosive shells burst among the rocks where Apache warriors had taken cover, and the psychological impact was devastating. These weren't bullets that you could dodge or arrows that you could block with a shield. These were explosions that could kill you even if you were hidden behind solid rock. The Apache had never encountered indirect fire weapons, had no tactics for dealing with artillery that could strike targets the gunners couldn't even see. For the first time in their military history, Apache warriors retreated from a battle they had chosen to fight. Mangas Coloradas was wounded in the fight, not seriously, but enough to convince him that maybe negotiation was worth trying again. The old giant, who had united the Apache bands through diplomacy, began reaching out to American officials. hoping to find some alternative to the total war that Carleton was waging. In January 1863, Mangas Coloradas agreed to meet with American representatives under a flag of truce. He came with a small escort, following the same diplomatic protocols that Cochise had observed at Apache Pass 2 years earlier, and the Americans betrayed him exactly the same way they had betrayed Cochise. But this time, they weren't content with just taking prisoners. Mangas Coloradas was tortured with heated bayonets, then shot while trying to escape. His massive skull was cut off and sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where scientists measured it and wrote learned papers about the cranial characteristics of savage races. The man who had spent 20 years trying to find ways for Apache and white people to coexist was mutilated and turned into a museum specimen. The message could not have been clearer. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no peaceful resolution to the Apache wars. The Apache had learned everything they needed to know about American promises and American justice. From now on, it would be war to the knife. Tom Jeffords was either the bravest man in Arizona Territory or completely insane. Probably both. In 1871, this red-bearded mail rider did something that should have gotten him killed. He rode alone into Cochise's stronghold in the Dragoon Mountains, speaking what Apache he'd managed to learn, asking for a meeting with the most feared war leader in the Southwest. For 10 years, Cochise had been killing every white man who entered his territory. His warriors had attacked stagecoaches, burned settlements, and made travel through southeastern Arizona so dangerous that the mail service couldn't find riders willing to take the job. 14 mail carriers had been killed in the previous year alone, and now this one man was riding straight into the heart of Apache territory, unarmed, asking for a face-to-face conversation with the man responsible for those deaths. Cochise could have killed Jeffords on sight, should have by every law of warfare that had governed Apache-white relations for the past decade. Instead, he agreed to talk. Maybe it was curiosity about this strange white man who spoke Apache and seemed to have no fear. Maybe it was respect for someone brave enough to ride alone into enemy territory. Or maybe Cochise was just tired of 10 years of constant warfare and wanted to see if there was any alternative. What Jeffords proposed was simple: safe passage for mail riders in exchange for leaving Apache families alone. No military operations in Cochise's territory. No attempts to capture or kill Apache civilians. Just let the mail go through, and let Apache people live in peace in their mountain strongholds. It shouldn't have worked. After everything that had happened, Bascom's betrayal, Mangas Coloradas's murder, Carleton's extermination campaign, there was no reason for Cochise to trust any white man's promises, but somehow, against all logic and precedent, it did work. For the next year, mail riders traveled safely through the Dragoon Mountains, while Apache families lived unmolested in their hidden canyons. Jeffords and Cochise developed something that neither culture had thought possible: a genuine friendship between enemies. This relationship became the foundation for the only Apache peace treaty that actually succeeded. In 1872, Cochise agreed to meet with General Oliver Howard, and the negotiations that followed created something unprecedented: a reservation that allowed Apache people to remain in their traditional homeland. The Chiricahua Reservation covered most of southeastern Arizona, including the sacred strongholds where Apache families had lived for generations. Cochise would serve as principal chief. Tom Jeffords would be the Indian agent, and Apache people could continue living according to their traditional customs as long as they stopped raiding. For Cochise personally, this treaty represented both vindication and sacrifice. He had proven that peaceful coexistence was possible, but the cost was enormous. Many of his own warriors saw the treaty as surrender, a betrayal of all the Apache who had died fighting for their freedom. Geronimo and other war leaders refused to accept the agreement, taking their followers deeper into the mountains of Mexico, where they could continue the resistance. But Cochise was dying, and he knew it. The stomach cancer that would kill him in 1874 was already eating away at him during the treaty negotiations. He wanted to ensure that his people would have some kind of future, even if it meant accepting American authority over land that had belonged to Apache families for countless generations. Meanwhile, General George Crook had arrived in Arizona with a completely different approach to the Apache problem. Where Carleton had tried to exterminate the Apache through starvation and superior firepower, Crook understood that only Apache could catch. Apache in this vertical wilderness of stone and canyon, Crook began recruiting. Apache scouts, warriors who would track their own people in exchange for regular pay and protection for their families. It was a brilliant and morally complicated strategy. The scouts knew every hiding place, every water source, every trail through the mountains. They could read tracks that were invisible to white soldiers, could move through terrain that would stop a conventional military unit completely, but they were also hunting their own relatives, following brothers and cousins and childhood friends who had chosen continued resistance over reservation life. The psychological toll on these men was enormous, but the alternative, watching their families starve on inadequate government rations, was often worse. The success of Crook's scout system became tragically apparent in April 1871, when a mixed force of Tucson civilians, Mexican volunteers, and Tohono O'odham warriors attacked a peaceful Apache band at Camp Grant. The Aravaipa Apache had been trying to surrender for months. Their leader, Eskiminzin, had brought his people to the army post, hoping to negotiate some kind of peaceful settlement. For weeks, they had been camping near the fort, proving their peaceful intentions by turning in their weapons and accepting military supervision. Lieutenant Royal Whitman, the post commander, had been slowly building trust with the Apache families. Children were playing with soldiers' dogs. Apache women were trading baskets for coffee and sugar. For the first time since the wars began, it looked like peaceful coexistence might actually be possible. And then, on April 30th, while Eskiminzin was away trying to convince other Apache leaders that peace was possible, a mob from Tucson attacked the sleeping camp at dawn. What followed wasn't warfare, it was butchery. The attackers used clubs instead of guns to save ammunition, beating to death anyone they could catch. 144 Apache were killed, almost all of them women and children. The few survivors fled into the desert, leaving behind a camp littered with the bodies of people who had trusted American promises of protection. Eskiminzin returned to find his wife and children dead, along with most of his band. The leader who had spent months convincing his people that peace was possible was left, standing in the ruins of everything he had tried to build. The man responsible for organizing the Camp Grant massacre was never prosecuted. The Tucson civilians who participated were celebrated as heroes, and Eskiminzin learned the same lesson that Cochise and Mangus Coloradas had learned before him. American law protected white people who killed Apache, but not Apache who trusted white promises. In 1874, Cochise died at his stronghold in the Dragoon Mountains, probably from the cancer that had been slowly consuming him for years. Before he died, he made Tom Jeffords promise to watch over his people, to try to protect them from the forces that would inevitably come for them after his death. That protection lasted exactly 1 year. In 1875, the federal government decided that having multiple Apache reservations was too expensive and too complicated. All Apache people would be concentrated at a single location, the San Carlos Reservation in central Arizona. Never mind that this would force mountain people to live in a malarial desert. Never mind that it would put traditional enemies in close proximity to each other. Never mind that it violated every promise made to Cochise in the 1872 treaty. The Apache called San Carlos Hell's 40 acres, and the name was accurate. Temperatures reached 120 degrees in summer. The alkali water made people sick. Government rations were inadequate to prevent starvation, and corrupt agents routinely sold Apache supplies to local merchants for personal profit. Apache people who had lived free in mountain strongholds for thousands of years were now confined to a desert prison, where they slowly starved under the Arizona sun. Traditional leaders were replaced by government appointees. Religious ceremonies were banned. Children were taken away to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak Apache or practice any aspect of their traditional culture. For many Apache, the choice became simple: slow death on the reservation or quick death in the mountains. Geronimo and other war leaders began breaking out of San Carlos regularly, each time gathering more desperate followers who preferred the risks of freedom to the certainty of cultural extinction. The final breakout came in September 1886, when Geronimo and 37 followers, 17 men, 13 women and 7 children, fled San Carlos for the last time. They were pursued by 5,000 American soldiers, hundreds of Apache scouts, and an unknown number of Mexican troops, all converging on a small group of Apache families who wanted nothing more than to live free in their traditional homeland. For 6 months, this tiny band of Apache managed to stay ahead of the largest military operation in the history of the American West. They covered thousands of miles, crossed international borders, and demonstrated once again that Apache warriors could outmaneuver any conventional force in familiar terrain, but they couldn't outrun hunger, exhaustion, and the simple mathematics of survival. When Geronimo finally agreed to meet with General Nelson Miles at Skeleton Canyon in September 1886, he wasn't surrendering to superior military force. He was acknowledging that there was nowhere left to run. The last free Apache had been outnumbered 200 to 1, and they had still managed to stay free for 6 months. It was a final demonstration of everything that had made the Apache such formidable opponents for 3.5 centuries. Their incredible skill as warriors, their intimate knowledge of the terrain, and their absolute refusal to accept defeat. But even the greatest warriors couldn't fight forever against impossible odds. The thunder in the mountains was finally beginning to fade. The train carrying Geronimo's people east stopped at every station, and crowds gathered like they were looking at zoo animals. "See the Apache terror," barked the conductors at each depot. The last of the wild Indians. People pressed against the windows, pointing and staring at the 37 Apache prisoners who sat in stunned silence, watching a world they had never imagined roll past outside. For warriors who had spent their entire lives in the vertical landscape of desert mountains, this journey was like traveling to another planet. Trees that lost their leaves, how was that possible? Water too vast to see across, Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon like an endless sky fallen to earth. Cities with more people than the total Apache population. Buildings that reached toward the clouds like stone mountains built by human hands. But what struck them most was the abundance. Mile after mile of farmland heavy with crops, herds of cattle that stretched beyond counting. Towns where every building was made of cut stone or milled lumber, where every street was wide enough for wagons to pass, where light glowed from windows even after the sun went down. These were the people who had been telling them there wasn't enough land for everyone to live in peace. Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, was where the train finally stopped. Built by the Spanish 3 centuries earlier, the stone fortress was designed to house maybe 50 soldiers, not 37 Apache prisoners, plus their guards. The thick walls that had once protected Spanish colonists from English pirates now trapped mountain people in a humid swamp where the air itself seemed to have weight. The Apache had never experienced humidity like this. In their homeland, sweat evaporated instantly in the dry desert air, cooling the body even in 100-degree heat. Here, moisture hung in the air like an invisible blanket, making every breath an effort. Children who had never been sick in the clean mountain air developed coughs that echoed off the stone walls day and night. Warriors who had once covered 60 miles in a day now paced the narrow confines of their prison like caged eagles, their eyes constantly drawn to the single window that showed a slice of sky they could never reach. Women who had gathered plants across thousands of square miles of desert now had access to a courtyard maybe 50 feet on each side. And then something happened that none of them had expected. A young soldier named David reached into his haversack, during the evening meal distribution and broke his hardtack ration in half. He walked over to an Apache child whose name translated roughly to Morning Star, a girl maybe 7 years old, all bones and huge dark eyes, and offered her half his bread. Morning Star stared at the food in confusion. This was the enemy, the blue-coated soldiers who had chased her family across thousands of miles of desert. Her father had died fighting these men. Her older brother had been shot by them during the final pursuit in Mexico, and now one of them was giving her food from his own ration. The warrior, Daklugi, watching from across the courtyard, was certain the bread must be poisoned. This had to be some final cruelty, a way to torture Apache children before killing them. He started to move forward to stop the girl from eating, but then David did something that changed everything. He took a piece of the hardtack and gave it to his dog, waiting for the animal to eat it before offering the rest to Morning Star. He was proving the food was safe, the only way an Apache would understand, by feeding it to something he cared about first. Other soldiers began to notice. Within days, it became common to see blue-coated young men sharing their coffee, their bacon, their sugar rations with Apache children who had been taught that these same men were monsters. For the Apache mothers watching this, the psychological impact was devastating. They had spent years telling their children that all Americans were enemies, that white soldiers existed only to kill Apache people. How do you explain to a 7-year-old girl that the man sharing his breakfast is the same enemy who shot her father? But the children were learning English words. Bread, water, please, thank you. Esh, and they were teaching the soldiers to count in Apache, to say hello and good morning in a language the soldiers had never heard before. Small exchanges, meaningless in themselves, but building bridges one word at a time between peoples who had been killing each other for decades. The soldiers were mostly young men from farming communities in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. Boys who had signed up for adventure and found themselves guarding the most famous prisoners in America. Most of them had never seen an Indian before, certainly had never lived in close proximity to Apache families. What they discovered was that Apache children played the same games as white children, that Apache mothers worried about their sick babies exactly the way their own mothers had worried about them, that Apache men told stories around small fires, that made everyone laugh even when you couldn't understand the words. At Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where some of the younger Apache were eventually sent, the cultural collision became even more complex. Geronimo's nephew, Jason Betsinez, discovered he had an aptitude for blacksmithing, working metal with a skill that impressed his instructors. But at night, in the dormitory darkness, he whispered Apache stories to younger children who were forbidden to speak their native language during the day. He told them how Coyote had stolen fire from the fire beings and given it to humans, how Changing Woman had created the Apache people from her own skin and breath, how the hero twins had killed the monsters that once terrorized the earth. Stories that connected these children to a world and a way of understanding that reached back thousands of years, kept alive through whispered words in a place designed to erase every trace of their Apache identity. The school's motto was, "Kill the Indian, save the man," and everything about Carlisle was designed to accomplish exactly that. Children had their hair cut short, their traditional clothes burned, their names changed to English versions. They were forbidden to speak Apache, forbidden to practice any Apache customs, forbidden even to think of themselves as Apache. But in the darkness between the dormitory beds, the old stories continued. Children who couldn't speak Apache during the day dreamed in Apache at night. Boys who spent their days learning to farm with metal plows spent their evenings teaching each other how their grandfathers had tracked deer through mountain forests. The administrators thought they were succeeding. Apache children were learning English, learning trades, learning to live like white Americans. What they didn't understand was that the children were also learning something else: how to survive. by appearing to surrender while keeping the essential parts of themselves hidden and safe. This was a skill that Apache people had been developing for centuries, the ability to adapt to impossible circumstances while preserving the core of what made them Apache. They had done it during 300 years of Spanish colonization, during the Mexican period, during the Apache Wars. Now they were doing it again in the humid stone chambers of Fort Marion and the regimented classrooms of Carlisle. But something else was happening too. Something that none of the participants fully understood at the time. The young soldiers sharing. Their rations, the Apache children learning English words, the gradual recognition on both sides that the enemy had human faces. All of this was creating relationships that would echo across generations. Some of those soldiers would go home to Wisconsin or Ohio and tell their families about the Apache children they had known. Some of those Apache children would grow up to be leaders of their people, carrying with them the memory that not all white men were enemies, that kindness was possible even between peoples who had been at war. It wasn't forgiveness. Too much blood had been spilled for that. It wasn't even reconciliation in any meaningful sense, but it was recognition, the first tentative acknowledgement that enemies could be human beings, that survival might require understanding as well as resistance. The bread shared in the courtyard of Fort Marion was just hardtack, flour and water baked until it was hard enough to survive months of storage. But it represented something larger, the possibility that people who had been killing each other for generations might find ways to live together without destroying everything that made them who they were. That possibility would be tested over and over again in the decades to come, as Apache children educated in white schools returned to reservations where the old ways were dying, where traditional leaders struggled to find paths between cultural extinction and hopeless resistance. But the memory of kindness from unlikely sources would prove more durable than anyone expected, echoing across generations in ways that violence never could. The tuberculosis moved through the Apache prisoners like smoke through dry grass, invisible and unstoppable. Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama was supposed to be better than Fort Marion. More space, cleaner air, a chance for the Apache to work outdoors instead of pacing stone courtyards. But the humid climate that made cotton grow so well in Alabama also created perfect conditions for the disease that Apache people had never encountered in their desert homeland. The cough started with the children first, a persistent hack that echoed through the wooden barracks buildings day and night. Then the fever, the weight loss, the bloody sputum that marked tuberculosis in its final stages. Apache parents who had survived decades of warfare watched helplessly as their children died from an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. Even Geronimo, the man whose name had once made Mexican soldiers flee in terror, was powerless against this microscopic killer. His daughter Eva died at Mount Vernon Barracks, wasting away despite every traditional healing ceremony her father could perform. The great war leader, who had never surrendered to any human enemy, was forced to surrender to a disease that he couldn't understand and couldn't defeat. But Geronimo was adapting to this new world in ways that shocked both his Apache followers and his American captors. The man who had once led raids across 2,000 miles of desert was now learning to pose for photographs, to sign autographs, to sell bows and arrows that he made between appearances at World's Fairs and Wild West shows, at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. Crowds lined up to see the last of the wild Indians. Geronimo would appear in traditional dress, demonstrate his skill with weapons, and sell photographs of himself for $2 each, more money than most working men made in a week. The irony was impossible to miss. The Apache leader, who had once been hunted by 5,000 soldiers, was now one of the most famous men in America, his image reproduced on postcards and souvenirs that people bought as proof they had seen the legendary Geronimo in person. In 1905, He rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade, sitting in a Cadillac automobile alongside other chiefs from various tribes. The man who had spent his entire life on horseback was now traveling in a machine powered by controlled explosions, moving faster than any horse could run, through streets filled with more people than lived in all of Apache territory. Roosevelt, who had written extensively about the winning of the West and the inevitability of civilization replacing savagery, found himself genuinely impressed by Geronimo's intelligence and dignity. The two men talked through interpreters about the old days, about the wars that had made them both famous, about the strange turn of fate that had brought them together as allies rather than enemies. But while Geronimo was becoming a celebrity, traditional Apache culture was dying in ways that no military campaign had ever achieved. On the reservations, Indian agents were systematically destroying everything that made Apache people distinctively Apache. The mountain spirit dances that had connected Apache communities to their sacred traditions for countless generations were now forbidden. Medicine men who tried to perform healing ceremonies were arrested. Children who spoke Apache in school were beaten. The ceremonies went underground, practiced in hidden canyons where government agents couldn't find them. Medicine men taught their apprentices in whispered conversations, passing down knowledge that had once been recorded on painted deerskins, but now had to be memorized completely because written records were too dangerous to keep. The sunrise ceremony for changing woman, the 4-day ritual that marked an Apache girl's transition to womanhood, continued in secret locations, with lookouts posted to watch for approaching agents. Young women still ran east at dawn, wearing elaborate dresses, covered with hundreds of tin cones, that sang like rain with every step. But now they ran in hidden places, where the songs of their ancestors couldn't be heard by the authorities who wanted to silence them forever. This was cultural survival through active resistance, but it came at an enormous cost. Traditional knowledge that had once been shared openly throughout Apache communities was now restricted to a few trusted individuals who risked imprisonment every time they practiced their healing arts or conducted their ceremonies. And then came the Great War, and everything changed again. When America entered World War I in 1917, Apache men volunteered for military service in numbers that far exceeded their percentage of the population. Young men whose fathers had fought the U.S. Army were now eager to fight for the United States against enemies they had never seen in places they had never heard of. It made no logical sense. These were people who had been imprisoned as prisoners of war, whose children had been taken away to boarding schools, whose traditional culture was being systematically destroyed by government policy. Why would they volunteer to fight for the country that had done all of this to them? The answer was complex, rooted in Apache concepts of honor, courage, and the warrior tradition that had always defined Apache manhood. Fighting for your people had always been the highest calling for Apache men. Now, with Apache communities incorporated into the United States, whether they liked it or not, defending America became a way of defending their people. But there was something else happening too. Military service offered Apache men a chance to prove that they were Americans without giving up everything that made them Apache. They could demonstrate their loyalty to the United States while also maintaining their identity as warriors in a tradition that stretched back centuries. The war transformed American perceptions of Apache people in ways that decades of peaceful coexistence had never achieved. Newspaper articles that had once described Apache as savage enemies now praised them as noble warriors fighting for democracy and freedom. The same papers that had celebrated the Camp Grant massacre now featured stories about Apache heroes earning medals for courage under fire. Between the wars, Apache communities began developing new strategies for cultural survival that went beyond simply hiding traditional practices from government agents. Charles Lupe, a Mescalero Apache leader, organized the first intertribal powwows, creating events that blended Apache customs with traditions from other tribes. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They allowed Apache people to practice modified versions of their traditional dances and ceremonies in a context that government agents found acceptable. They created connections between Apache communities and other tribes facing similar challenges. Most importantly, they demonstrated that Apache culture could adapt and change while still remaining distinctively Apache. The powwows represented a new phase in Apache cultural survival, not just preservation of ancient traditions, but the creation of new traditions that honored the past while acknowledging the reality of life in the 20th century. Apache children learned traditional dances alongside modern ones, spoke Apache alongside English, and began to understand that being Apache didn't require living exactly as their ancestors had lived. This was adaptation on a scale that even the most successful Apache war leaders had never imagined. Instead of fighting to preserve an unchanging way of life, Apache communities were learning to preserve the essential spirit of their culture while allowing the external forms to evolve with changing circumstances. It was a survival strategy that would prove more effective than any military resistance had ever been. The ceremonies that Indian agents had tried to destroy were being transformed into forms that could survive government persecution. The languages that boarding schools had tried to eliminate were being maintained alongside English. The warrior traditions that the army had tried to crush were being channeled into military service that made Apache men heroes instead of enemies. But this transformation came with its own costs. Every adaptation was also a loss. Every successful modification of traditional practice was also an acknowledgement that the old ways were gone forever. Apache people were surviving as Apache, but they were also becoming something new, something that their ancestors would have recognized but might not have understood. The songs were half-remembered now, the stories told in English as often as in Apache, the ceremonies modified to fit the constraints of reservation life. But they were still songs, still stories, still ceremonies. The essential core of what made Apache people Apache had survived everything that 3 centuries of warfare had not been able to destroy. And in that survival, there was a kind of victory that no military campaign could ever achieve. The radio crackled to life in the Pacific dawn, and the voice speaking was Apache, enemy forces moving east toward Hill 273. Approximately 2 companies, supported by armor. On the other end of that transmission, another Apache voice acknowledged, "Message received," relaying to command. It was 1943, and the grandchildren of warriors who had been forbidden to speak their native language were now using that same forbidden language to transmit unbreakable military codes across the battlefields of World War II. The irony was so perfect. It seemed like something Coyote might have arranged in one of the old stories. The Apache code talkers weren't as famous as their Navajo counterparts, but they were just as effective. Japanese code breakers who had successfully penetrated American communications repeatedly found themselves baffled by transmissions in a language that most Americans had never heard of, spoken by men whose very existence challenged everything the enemy thought they knew about American society. Think about this for a moment. These were the sons and grandsons of people who had been classified as prisoners of war, whose children had been beaten for speaking Apache in government schools, whose entire culture had been marked for extinction by official federal policy. Now they were the most trusted communicators in the American military. Their savage language transformed into one of America's most valuable strategic assets. Back home, another kind of revolution was brewing. When Del Chino understood something that most tribal leaders were just beginning to grasp. Survival in the 20th century would require taking control of your own destiny, instead of waiting for government officials to solve your problems. Born on the Mescalero Apache Reservation in 1923, Chino grew up during the worst years of the Depression, when Apache families survived on government commodities and whatever work they could find, in a region where steady employment was almost non-existent. But where others saw only problems, Chino saw possibilities. The Mescalero Reservation included some of the finest timber, land in New Mexico, forests of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir that had been largely untouched because no one had figured out how to harvest them profitably. White-owned logging companies had tried and failed, defeated by the remote location and difficult terrain. In the 1950s, Chino convinced the tribal council to take direct control of their timber resources instead of leasing them to outside companies. Apache loggers would harvest Apache trees on Apache land, with the profits going directly to Apache communities instead of to corporate shareholders in distant cities. It was revolutionary economic development that strengthened tribal sovereignty instead of undermining it. The Mescalero Apache became one of the first tribes to demonstrate that you could participate in the modern American economy without surrendering control of your traditional homeland. But Chino wasn't finished. In the 1960s, he proposed something even more audacious, the first tribally owned ski resort in American history. Ski Apache would be built on sacred Sierra Blanca, the white mountain that had always been central to Mescalero's spiritual life. The proposal was controversial, even within the Apache community. Traditional leaders worried about commercializing a sacred site. Federal officials worried about Indians running a complex business operation without white supervision. Chino's response was characteristically direct. Our ancestors survived in these mountains for 1,000 years. I think we can figure out how to run a ski resort. He was right. Ski Apache opened in 1963 and became profitable within 5 years, generating revenue that funded housing projects, educational programs, and health services throughout the reservation. More importantly, it demonstrated that Apache people could succeed in modern business while maintaining their connection to traditional lands. The 1960s brought a new kind of Apache activism. When the federal government proposed building astronomical telescopes on Mount Graham, another sacred site in traditional Apache territory, a descendant of the legendary Lozon-led protests that combined traditional religious arguments with modern environmental science, the telescopes would not only desecrate a sacred site, but also threaten the habitat of the Mount Graham red squirrel, an endangered species found nowhere else on Earth. It was brilliant strategy. Use federal environmental laws to protect sites that traditional Apache religion had always considered sacred. The legal battle lasted for decades and achieved something remarkable. Federal courts were forced to recognize that Apache religious beliefs deserved the same legal protection as any other form of worship. Sacred sites that had been dismissed as superstition by previous generations. Federal officials were now acknowledged as legitimate religious locations, deserving constitutional protection. But the most dramatic transformation was still to come in the 1980s and 90s. Apache nations across the Southwest began opening casinos, using the sovereignty that their ancestors had fought and died to preserve as the foundation for economic enterprises that generated billions of dollars in revenue. The Fort McDowell Apache in Arizona built one of the first tribally owned casinos in the country, creating thousands of jobs and generating enough revenue to build new schools, hospitals, and community centers. The San Carlos Apache followed with their own gaming operations, using casino profits to fund language preservation programs and cultural education initiatives. It was a perfect circle of historical irony. The legal sovereignty that had allowed Apache people to maintain their identity through centuries of persecution was now the foundation for economic independence that freed them from dependence on federal government programs. Critics called it a betrayal of traditional values, but Apache leaders saw it differently. Casino gaming was simply the latest example of what Apache people had always done: adapt new technologies and opportunities to serve traditional goals of community. survival and prosperity, and the old traditions continued, often in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. At sunrise on White Mountain Apache land, young women still run east in their changing woman ceremonies, tin cones singing the old songs as they have for countless generations. But now, some of those same young women post photos of the ceremony on Instagram, sharing their cultural pride with Apache people scattered across the globe. The Fort Apache Historic Park, where soldiers once imprisoned Geronimo's people, now hosts Apache-led tours, where descendants of both warriors and soldiers tell the complex truth of survival, resistance, and the long journey toward mutual understanding. Visitors learn about the Apache Wars not as a simple story of civilization versus savagery, but as a complicated human drama where both sides made choices that seemed necessary at the time but looked different in retrospect. Modern Apache communities operate their own schools where children learn calculus in English and traditional stories in Apache. They run their own hospitals where Western medicine works alongside traditional healing practices. They manage their own businesses, their own governments, their own futures in ways that honor both ancient wisdom and contemporary realities. The children who were once fed hardtack by enemy soldiers grew up to be the grandparents who ensured Apache languages. Ceremonies and identity survived every attempt to destroy them. That kindness, offered from unlikely sources in the stone courtyards of Fort Marion and the dormitories of Carlisle, echoed across generations in ways that violence never could. Today, Apache languages are being preserved through digital archives that their ancestors could never have imagined. Traditional stories are being recorded by Apache storytellers for Apache children, who might live anywhere from Phoenix to New York City, but still need to know where they come from. Ceremonies that were once practiced in hidden Caney